I'm sure some folks will disagree with this next statement, but I believe one of the top milestones for a new photographer is when they begin the gradual shift away from shooting everything in JPEG and start leaning more towards shooting in RAW. And I fully understand the hesitation, or I guess the intimidation that's associated with shooting in RAW. After all, it takes a bit of getting used to, especially once you become comfortable with capturing an image in JPEG and looking at the back of your camera and seeing a vibrant and well-exposed photograph, as opposed to shooting in RAW and reviewing your photo only to be greeted with a muted and I guess a flat-looking rendition of an otherwise beautiful scene that's unfolding right in front of your very eyes. Now, don't get me wrong, I do not believe that you must always shoot in RAW in order to become a better photographer, but shooting in RAW forces you to better understand the editing process, which I do believe will in turn create a better photographer within yourself. And for those that are not familiar with, I guess, the advantages of shooting in a RAW format, well, at a very, very high level, shooting in RAW provides you with I guess much greater flexibility and latitude during post-processing for things such as recovering dark shadows or fixing overly bright highlights and editing and enhancing colors. And in this video, I want to share with you a real simple workflow that I go through on every single one of my images that enables me to really take advantage of the power and flexibility that comes with editing a RAW photograph. So to jump right into it, now this is the image that we're going to be editing here. This is a photograph that, this is actually the RAW file here. This is the final version right here. Posted this on Instagram a couple of weeks ago, and it seemed like a lot of people liked it. I really enjoy the way that this photograph came out, but this is the RAW file. So as you can see, huge difference from the before to the after. Now this workflow, very simple to do. You can do it on every single photograph. And the very first thing that I'm going to do, well, what I'm going to do in this one though, is just go ahead and just create a crop that is more in line with the final version of this photograph. I believe, is that pretty close? Yeah, close enough. So the very first thing that I always like to do is I like to go in and adjust the exposure, fix any type of exposure issues, because after all, when you look at this photograph right now, it's dim, it's dark, it's kind of hard to work with. So I want to go ahead and correct the exposure just to get it to, kind of get the palette to a point to where it's a little bit easier to work with. And I do that in a couple ways. Of course, the most obvious way is just to come up here to exposure, and let's just go ahead and boost this up. And I'm paying attention to the histogram. As you can see, this is where it was pushed all the way to the left, pushed over to the darks. And I want to go ahead and kind of shift that more towards the right. And I'm going to do that by increasing the exposure a touch here. And if you ever struggle with trying to determine exactly how far to push certain sliders, a real quick tip and something that I find insanely beneficial is to hold down the Shift key, and you can double click any of these. So if I hold down Shift and double click the word exposure, that will automatically tell me that Lightroom is suggesting that almost a full stop of exposure is needed to properly expose this photograph. Now, it doesn't mean that that's the absolute perfect amount of exposure, but that's a good kind of leading indicator that Lightroom is telling you is a good place to start. So I'm going to boost it up a little bit more than that. I'm also going to come over here to highlights, and I'm going to kind of bring those down a little bit. And as you can see, pretty much all the highlights in this image is just the water below. And I don't want to lose any of that detail. So I'm going to kind of bring those highlights down just a touch. The shadows, you can kind of see there's a fair amount of shadow recovery up there in the canyon walls. Doesn't need to be too terrible. And once again, if I'm not sure exactly how much shadow recovery to apply, hold down the Shift key, double click the word shadow, and Lightroom is indicating plus 33. I think they're pretty accurate on this one. And I think maybe somewhere right there looks good. And let's hit the backslash key just to see where we started. So this is the RAW photograph, and this is after our exposure, I was gonna say exposure issues are corrected. I guess that's the right way to put it. But when I think about exposure, I think of the exposure slider, I think about highlights, and I think about shadows. So those are kind of the three sliders that I'll go ahead and adjust when I want to go ahead and get that exposure looking correct. Now, the very next thing I do is I go in, and once I have kind of a palette that I can work with, I can see this image much clearer now than I did when it was a RAW photograph without any editing applied. But now that I can see this image better, now I want to go and adjust the white balance. In full disclosure, white balance is the thing that I struggle with the most. And I'm not saying that my technique is the way to do it. but this is what I go through. So what I'll do is I'll always kind of grab the little eye picker here and drop this on something that's kind of, maybe gray or maybe white, something that doesn't have a whole lot of color in it at all. For this image, I think I'm just going to pick this area right here. It looks like a fairly neutral target. And as you can see, it did a pretty substantial change to the overall white balance, added +10 on the temperature, -25 on the tint. And I think for right now, I think that looks good. I almost always find that, add your white balance on kind of in the early stages. And then once you go through the rest of your editing process, I find that you want to probably readjust that white balance at the end again. But I think that this right here is a pretty good starting point. So now that the exposure is corrected, we have our white balance set. I'm going to go ahead and add contrast, because that's one of the big that's one of the big, differentiating factors of a raw photograph versus a JPEG image, is the fact that usually raw images look very flat. They lack contrast. And there's multiple different ways to add contrast. You can of course use the contrast slider, adjusting the white point and the black point also adds a little bit of contrast as well. So I like to start with the white point and the black point, and if you're anything like me, sometimes it's pretty hard to tell exactly how you want to move these sliders. But once again, that quick tip we discussed earlier, hold down the shift key, I'm gonna double click white, and I'm gonna double click black. So that is what Lightroom is indicating. I'm gonna bring this the whites down just a touch, and I'm gonna bring these blacks down, or I should say back up a fair amount. I don't want the blacks to be that deep in this image. I think something about right there looks good. Might even bring the whites up just a little bit more. And I think that looks pretty good. Let's check and see where we started. This is the raw, and this is where we're at right now. Now, the next way you can add contrast, of course, is using the contrast slider or using the tone curve. For this particular image, I don't want to add a whole lot more contrast than that is already in there right now. So I'm just going to use this contrast slider. I think I'm just going to add just a touch. If we hold on the shift key and double click contrast, I don't want to add a whole lot here. I'm thinking maybe just +5 looks pretty good. Now, something that I like to do, and this is just purely my preference, is to kind of fade the blacks a little bit or fade the shadows. I find that images that have very, very deep blacks in the photograph, to me, that kind of is synonymous with that digital look. And I think if you review a lot of film photographs or photographs captured on film, a lot of those blacks aren't as deep. So they're a little bit more faded, and I kind of like that look. It's got kind of more of a filmic look. It kind of softens the overall photograph a little bit more, and it's a real simple process to do. Just come down to the tone curve. I'm going to add a anchor point right here, one right in the middle, and one in the upper right-hand corner, and then one right down here. And then I usually take this, Command Z. I usually take the bottom anchor point here, and I lift this up to where the output is right around 30. And as you can see, it's right there. And then I'll take this next one and kind of bring that up to around 30 as well. Might bring this one down just a touch more. Bring this over a little bit. And it might look like we haven't done a whole lot, but if I toggle this on and off, you can really see the difference, especially if you pay attention to the areas of black up here. So this is without the tone curve and with the tone curve. Without and with. So I hope you can see that at home. It's a real subtle change, but to me, it makes all the difference in the world. And now that we've added the contrast with the black point, with the black point, with the black point, with the white point, and the contrast slider, I'm looking at my white balance and I really no longer like the way it looks. It's looking a little bit too warm for my taste. So I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to reduce this temperature just a little bit to about right there. And I'm going to take this tint and I'm going to shift it back more towards magenta. Just a tiny, tiny little bit. I'm going to increase that exposure a little bit as well. And let's toggle this on and off again. So this is where we started and this is where we're at now, before and after. So a huge difference so far, and really just 3 steps: updating the exposure, updating the white balance, and adding contrast to the overall photograph. Now the next thing is colors. My favorite part of probably editing photographs is enhancing the colors in an image. And when you're shooting in a raw format, the power and the flexibility that you have to enhance colors is absolutely tremendous. And one of the ways that I like to do it right out of the gate is just to come down here to the calibration section and start just kind of moving these saturation sliders around. And once again, like everything, I like to swing these sliders far to the left and far to the right so I can really see what's happening. I'm just going to add a little bit of saturation to this red primary channel because I really like what that's doing to the canyon walls in the background. And let's do the same thing with the green. And I like that as well. So I'm going to add a little bit of green saturation there. And let's check out the blue primary. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm thinking of just below +10 on all three of these. Maybe about right there. I'm going to add a little bit more to the green, a little bit to the red as well. And if we toggle this on and off, this is before and after, before and after. And the reason I like to use the calibration section as opposed to just boosting the global saturation is I find that you can get a little bit richer tones or richer colors or colors that have a little bit more depth when you use that calibration section. So I always start right there. And then oftentimes I'll come up here to the basic section and add just a little bit of global vibrance, maybe right around there, looks good. And then hop down here to the HSL section. And then one of my favorite things to do is to shift the colors, the hues of certain colors, and along with utilizing the luminance values of them as well. Or I should say, altering the luminance values of certain colors. So one of the first things I want to do is I'm going to take this green slider here, and if I swing it back and forth, you can see if I take the hue all the way to the right, it really makes those greens pop. If I shift them more towards to the left, it makes it feel a little bit more like a kind of like a fall photograph. So I'm going to do something right about there. I think looks pretty good. Do I want to do anything? No, I don't want to mess with that at all. I'm going to come down to luminance. Now, if you're not familiar with what luminance is, it's basically the brightness value of certain colors. And I love using luminance, and you'll see why right here. So I'm going to come over here to the green channel. If you pay attention to the leaves on the tree as I change this slider, look what's happening. Such a difference. And I love to do that because before, the tree was getting a little bit lost in this photograph. And it's not standing out as much. And that is the predominant subject in this photograph. I love the kind of the rocks and the waves leading up to the tree. So the tree is really the main star of this show, and I want to make it pop. So by bringing up the luminance of this to about right there, really does that. And if I toggle this on and off, you can see this is before and after, before and after. So a huge change just right there. Now, do I want to do anything with the color of the water? And I'm just kind of moving this into the saturation section. Maybe a little bit of aqua in here as well. Kind of maybe add just a little bit right through there. And let's toggle this whole section on and off again. So before and after, before and after. And I think those canyon walls might be getting a little bit too saturated, so we could dial that back just a touch right through here maybe. And I think that looks pretty good right there. And let's go ahead and toggle the entire edit off once again from raw to where we're at right now. So this is before, after, before, and after. I want to do one more thing in the color section. I'm going to take the luminance of the orange channel, and you can see what that's doing. And pretty much everything that's orange is just kind of brightening up just a little bit more. And I think that is looking pretty good right there. There, that looks pretty good. Now, the final step in all of this is to enhance the details. So there's three main ways to do that inside of Lightroom. You can do it by utilizing the clarity slider. You can do it by utilizing the texture slider. And of course, you can sharpen the overall photograph as well. Now, the clarity slider pretty much enhances the larger size details in your image. The texture slider enhances small to medium size detail in your image. What I like to do is come up here and add about -10 to about -15 on the clarity, and then add +10 or maybe +15 on the texture. And to me, that kind of just softens the overall image down just a little bit, while at the same time not losing any kind of detail in the overall image as well. So I'm kind of softening the largest size detail in the image, and I'm enhancing the small to medium size detail in the overall photograph. And once again, that's just purely just my taste. And then of course you can come down to the detail section and just add a little bit of sharpening. I don't add too much sharpening to my overall photographs, sometimes usually around 30 or 40. And I'll take the detail up to maybe about 50. And then I'm going to hold down the Option key and drag this masking slider over quite a bit because I don't really want to sharpen a lot of the areas of the water. I pretty much only want the areas in white that's going to receive the sharpening to predominantly be the tree and the canyon walls in the background. And I think that looks pretty good right there. So now that all 5 steps are complete, I always like to revisit that white balance and the exposure just one more time. And for this image, I think I'm going to add just a little bit more exposure. I think the white balance is looking pretty good. But this is the raw file right here. This is without any edits at all, straight out of camera. And this is where we're at right now. And that's just a real quick workflow. That's what I go through on every single raw photograph. And I find that that is a great way to get to really maximize what you're getting out of the raw file by adjusting that white balance, by adjusting any kind of exposure issues that you're having, enhancing those colors in the overall photograph, and enhancing any kind of detail that you want to really bring out in your overall image as well. And of course, adding that contrast to the overall photograph is key when it comes to shooting in RAW. And very rarely do I ever finish an edit inside of Capture One or inside of Lightroom. I almost always have to wrap it up inside of Photoshop, whether it's the Orton effect or if I want to remove some kind of distraction in the overall image or whatever the case may be. But that's just kind of a real simple kind of 5-step process that you can go through, and it's kind of a raw conversion, if you will, just something that's easy to remember. That's the way that I operate the best, is when it's something that's very simple for me to remember. If it's kind of bounces all over the place or there's not a kind of set pattern to do things, that's when I start to forget things, and that's just the way that my mind operates. But I really do hope that that was helpful. And if you have any questions about editing raw photographs, please leave those in the comment section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really, really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.